Yeah, God, just want to bring Lesley before you, just before she shares. I pray that she will just be able to share what you have put on her heart, and that we'll just be open to receive it and hear what you have to say to each of us. Amen.
Okay, hello. So yes, we're continuing our series on open eyes, open hearts, and we've been looking at how some sort of creative practice can speak to us. I don't think we'll ever forget Dawn talking to us about Bruce Almighty, meeting Habakkuk, and I particularly loved the connection between John Coltrane and Julian of Knowledge. And then last week, Andrew took a painting, and he talked up, which was about Elijah being comforted and supported by God at a time of his sort of lowest point. But today I'm sort of coming from a slightly different point of view, in that I want to share something about my own creative practice and how that's been rooted in my relationship with God. Many, many years ago, when I first moved to Edinburgh, it was to go to art college. And that time I discovered that if I told people that I was an art student, their reaction was often something along the lines was, "Oh, good, you can make a poster for our evangelistic outreach." and that, for those of you, this was a really long time ago I'm talking about. We actually used to do those things by hand. And as someone who's pretty dyslexic, there was inevitably some spelling mistakes in anything that I made. And that used to really irritate people. It was almost as if I had failed in my only possible purpose. So like some of you out there who are also art backgrounds, I had to find out on what on earth I was meant to be doing, and how could I, as a visual artist, make work that was in any way meaningful. So I began a search for some visual language and imagery that that would be meaningful for me. And I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about how I found myself turning to mountains, and why using the visual imagery of landscape was about much more for me than just depicting a nice view. So, Joe, can I have the first slide, please? So, this is a picture of my father in 1980. He's aged 53. And as you can see, even allowing for the passing of time, he wasn't exactly a fashion icon. And the reason that he's looking so pleased with himself is that the mountain he is sitting on the top of is the Matterhorn. And this had significance for our family for multiple reasons, and as an example of why our relationship with mountains had such importance. 33 years before this photograph was taken, my father was 20, and he lost his only much-loved brother on this mountain in a tragic accident, along with 2 other friends. My father was the only survivor of the group of friends who'd been climbing together in the Alps that year. And they were buried together in Zermatt. And their story so intrigued one visitor to the cemetery, a man called Matteo Cabello, that he wrote a book, and it was called Of Mountains and Men, exploring the question of why do people climb mountains? Why indeed? Why would my father return to the mountains after such a tragedy? Why would he bring up his family to spend almost all of our holidays climbing mountains? As children, we were lucky enough to have a good 3 weeks away in the summer, camping usually, always with a particular set of hills in mind. On rainy Sundays, we would go to whatever church was nearby, and that was a great experience. We experienced a huge range of all sorts of different churches. I remember going to services that were only in Gaelic and listening to that amazing sound of Gaelic singing. So we had some real treats, but those were only rainy Sundays. Because if it was a good day, we would head for the hills. because my father said that you were closer to God in the hills than anywhere else. It was very rare for my father to talk to us about God or his faith. And looking back, it seems to me that everything he taught me about God and living a life with God, he taught me through climbing mountains. So not surprising then that in my own art practice, mountains came to have a prominent place. So Joel, can we have the next slide, please? So here in Scotland, we have mountains that have stayed the same generation after generation. That's not true in every part of the world. There are parts of the world where earthquakes are still happening and volcanoes are still erupting. I've got a sister who lives in New Zealand, and she lives in Wellington. If you don't know if you know, Wellington's a huge bay, and she lives on the opposite side of that bay to the main city of Wellington. And there's only one road round from her, where she lives, round to the main Wellington. And that is built on the only bit of flat land that there is. And that only is 450 years old. That was raised by an earthquake. I was thinking, what's it like to live in a landscape that changes? You know, you think that 450 years is nothing really, is it? And that's the only road out. But in Scotland, that's not the case. We have some very ancient mountains here, and they speak to me about the unchanging nature of God. Kirsty mentioned trees that she walked around, amongst in Wales earlier this summer, telling a similar story. They were here before me, and they will still be here long after me. Mountains are bigger than me. You have to come to a mountain with respect, an acknowledgement that it is big and I am small. And this gives me a grounding perspective, a sense of my place in a bigger story. And yet, I'm going to add a note of caution here. I've come across lots and lots of photographs, you know, on calendars or on posters, beautiful picture of some kind of mountain scenery, and that verse from Psalm 121 about lifting your eyes to the hills. And somehow they used to leave me with the impression that somehow just looking at a mountain was meant to be a source of help. So I like the message version of Psalm 121, which says, I look up to the mountains. Does my strength come from mountains? No. My strength comes from God, who made heaven and earth and mountains. The mountains themselves don't do anything, although the grounding they give me can be helpful. But they do speak to me about who God is. Okay, Joel, can we have the next one, please? Okay. So they speak to me about my place in creation. In the mountains, I'm reminded that these incredible structures are part of creation as I am, that we're both part of how God chooses to reveal his glory. Now, whatever our views on the practicalities of the creation progress, the creation process, the mountains know what really happened. They were there. The rocks we walk across know how they came into being. Scottish mountains, geologists reckon, are about 3 million years old. They stand as some of the oldest landscapes on the earth. They know who their creator is and how they were formed. And perhaps they do have a voice if we choose to listen. So, Jill, can we move on to the next slide, please? I'm reminded of when Jesus said that if the children stopped shouting out when he entered Jerusalem, the stones would shout instead. I'm reminded of where it says in Isaiah, the mountains and hills will burst into song before you. So I want my work to express something of the song that the land sings, acknowledging its creator, crying out, as the writer of Romans describes, all of creation groaning for the sons of God to be revealed, longing for us, Lot, to get a move on with our job of allowing ourselves to be made more like Jesus. And this has consequences for me about the choices that I make daily, about how I live. I learned that you have to adapt to different conditions that you encounter walking in the mountains, depending on the time of the year and what the weather's like. And so in life, there will be seasons when I consciously choose to find ways to connect with Jesus through maybe engaging with scripture, prayer practices, all the other disciplines of life in a community, and to allow him through these things to change and shape me. And then there's other seasons where I allow him to carry me when I can't do much for myself. Times like Andrew talked about when Elijah was at his lowest point. He came to an end of himself. It's a process of learning to trust in every season. Recently, Tricia Kay sent me a card. She often has just the right thing at the right time, I find in my life. And she sent me a card with a quote from Jude 1, loved by the Father and kept by Jesus Christ. And the more I think about that, the more I realize how true it is that there's seasons where we just have to allow Jesus to keep us. And then there's that aspect of Hills calling me into a responsible relationship with the earth, thinking about the small daily choices I make about how I care for the environment, how I can be a responsible consumer, how I can take my part in protecting creation as I'm mandated to steward well. Okay, can we go on to the next slide? I maybe should have explained that all these are my images. This is all work that I've made at some point in my life. So these are just things that, being in mountains as a child, my father gave me the opportunity to absorb. It wasn't a conscious process. More deliberate, perhaps, was his part in teaching us how to do life well through walking in mountains. In Romans 8, it talks about living in the in-between times, the waiting time. It compares it to that time before giving birth when you know it will take place, but you're having to wait, not knowing when. And maybe those of you who've had the privilege of having a child will know that's really difficult. I've personally found that last few weeks really, really hard. At the times when the thought comes through your mind, I'm not sure this was such a good idea after all. And knowing I can do nothing about it. But that waiting, not knowing when something was going to happen, I found incredibly hard. Maybe a more trivial analogy would be comparing it to a Netflix series. When you've got to maybe episode 5 or 6, and the plot's been set up, the characters are established, and you know that you're going to have to now go through all the crises and difficulties and the misunderstandings and the sabotages will occur. The remaining episodes will be full of tension until the resolution of the ending. And these are the days we're living in. We know the beginning of the story. We know the final ending. But we're living in the tension of the waiting days, the waiting times. And sometimes, as we know, that can be really hard. Looking back, these are the things that walking in mountains with my father seemed to etch into me. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. In this landscape, you can see the hills in the background are a bit misty in the distance. But there's these lines in the front they're not in a kind of normal perspective. But they're maybe lines of a ploughed field, the scoring of something man-made into the landscape. And looking back, these are the things that walking in my mountains with my father seemed to etch into me, like the lines of this ploughed field marked this landscape. With things like just how to keep going, how to put one foot in front of another when you're tired and you're not sure you can make it. And there's something about finding a way when you thought there wasn't a way. One thing my father taught us was how to look at a mountain, to look at a landscape and work out what's the best way to approach it? Maybe sometimes you look at something and you think there's absolutely no way you could get up there. But if you looked at a map, perhaps, or even just looking at the way the hillside was formed, he taught us to work out which the best way to go was. You could look at a hillside and think it was impossible to find a way, but by trusting that map, and perhaps a bit of a path, you could find it was doable. I remember thinking often, you'd head up some gully and think, how on earth are we going to get up there? And then you'd find that somebody had made a wee bit of a path for you to follow. That somebody had been there before. But then even after all the sensible preparation and precautions, you can still set off not being entirely sure that you can make it. And that's okay. So there are things that I believe God etched into me, some good things that my father taught me. Things like trust and resilience and perseverance. Now, if I put my sozo hat on for a moment, I always say to everybody, there's no such thing as being born into the perfect family. So that, of course, there have been some things to unlearn. Because none of us have ever been the perfect parent who didn't make mistakes. So there will always be things that I need to unlearn. That's true for everybody. To realize what those things might be, things to forgive, things to allow ourselves to be healed from, things that we've unconsciously taken on board that are not helpful in following Jesus faithfully. But that's not the topic for today. Finding out what those things have been and letting them go has made me appreciate all the more the good things that I learned. So can we move on to the next slide, please, Joel? So when I'm walking in mountains, I find myself realigned with my Creator, realigned with my purpose in creation. And through the physical process of walking, I've learned how to live in the waiting time. And today, I want to celebrate what my father taught me through walking in mountains. And I hope that my response in my creative practice reflects something of that. My gratitude for what I learned, and to celebrate that in a visual way. This is a picture of the Pentlands. I'm going to finish today with a poem that I wrote. I read this to my mother yesterday because she asked me what I was doing this morning, and I said, I'm talking about Dad. My dad, I should say, passed away about 10 months ago. And I read her this poem, and she said to me, I think everything your father taught you about God, he taught you through walking in mountains, didn't he? And I said, Mum, that's actually what I've written down here. She said, he didn't talk to you much about his faith, did he? But everything you learned, that's how he taught you. So, this is the poem, and it's called Things My Father Taught Me About Mountains. My father taught me how to put one foot in front of another, to watch the ground, to see where there was a place, a sure space for the next step. He said, watch my feet and put your feet where mine have been. And so I learnt to climb mountains slowly, tired or not tired, steadily. He taught me that reaching the top is not the whole story. He taught me about being prepared for false summits, to trust a map, to trust that there could be a way where you thought there was no way, discovering that all along there was a path made by the feet of those who had been that way before. He taught me about finding a way in rain or mist or snowstorm. He showed me what it was like to sleep under the stars. I learnt that accidents do happen, and sometimes you limp home. That pain and loss does not rule out return. Etched into me by wind and sun and rain, these are the things my father taught me about mountains.